Our next interview is with William Reese of the Reese Company of New Haven, Connecticut, perhaps America's most important bookseller. He won't say that, but I will. And Bill, could you just tell us a little bit about your background, family, were you born, education, etc.?
I was born in a small town in Maryland, Havre de Grace, Maryland. I grew up on a farm in Maryland. I went to school in Baltimore and then later to Yale University, and graduated from Yale University in 1977. And that's all the education I have except what I've learned in the antiquarian book business.
Which is a great deal. When did you first realize that you wanted to be a bookseller?
Well, I was interested in books from a very early age, as you know, because you and I have known each other since I was a teenager.
That's true.
I was a book collector, but I first got interested in being a bookseller when I got to know Peter Decker, who was one of the great figures in Western Americana, who was retired by that point, who I met because of going to Yale. He was a great friend of Archie Hanna, who was the curator of Western Americana at the Beinecke Library. And through him I met Peter, and Peter encouraged me to think about going into the trade. Peter at that point was 82, he was retired, but he was still in touch with the book business. He still had an office that Jack Bartfield let him maintain on 57th Street. And he still went into work every day and sat there and read novels in Jack's back room. And I started to come down from New Haven to see Peter and talk to him. And ultimately, one of Peter's clients died, and his family wanted to sell the collection. Peter was not interested in doing it because he was really retired from the book business, but he introduced me to the opportunity, and I bought it. And that's how I got in the book business.
That was your first major purchase?
Right, which was in April of 1975, so almost exactly 35 years ago from when we're doing this interview.
You didn't always have the Reese Company. Before you started your own business, talk a little bit about your association with Fred White Jr. and Frontier America.
Well, when I first when I bought this collection in 1975, I was a sophomore at Yale, and I wanted to finish my undergraduate career. And I was still not completely sure I wanted to be a bookseller, and I thought I might want to go on and get a doctorate and teach American history or something like that. So I was good friends with Freddie White, and I proposed to him that we do it together. And since he had a regular up-and-running book business as Fred White Jr. Bookseller, and so we changed the name to Frontier America Corporation, and we continued that through all the period I was an undergraduate. And then after I graduated in 1977, I worked for Archie Hanna at the Beinecke Library at Yale for about 6 months, mainly isolating things that were in the open stacks in the Sterling Library at Yale that should have been in Beinecke. And then at that point, I really decided I wanted to be in the book business full time. Freddie was in Texas, I was in New England. I wanted to stay in New England, and I felt New England was a much better place to be a bookseller and to find books. And so we really had an amiable parting of the ways and divided up the stock in 1979. And so in late 1979, I started the William Reese Company, and I issued my first catalog as William Reese Company in January of 1980.
Were you at your present location then, or were you someplace different?
I was close to my present location. I was living in New Haven, and I had already bought the townhouse at 409 Temple Street where my offices had been. I was renovating it. I actually finished renovating it in the fall of 1980. So since then, almost all of the history of the Reese Company, that's been my headquarters. And initially I lived there as well. It was my home as well. And in 1985, I was able to buy the building next door. In 1987, I got married and moved out, and it's been solely my office since then.
And now you're renovating again?
And now I'm renovating it again, yes, yeah.
Let me just ask you a couple of questions, get your opinion. What are some of the aspects of the book business that have changed dramatically since you've been a bookseller?
Well, I think the most overwhelming single thing is the internet. When I entered the book business, and for really everybody who'd been in the book business before then, there was a very, very steep learning curve to understanding what the books were, where to find the books, how to value the books. And there was a tremendous amount of acquired knowledge that in retrospect, gave a huge advantage to the people who were veterans in the business and the people who worked hard at the business. Just finding stuff, getting stuff, buying stuff, selling stuff. There weren't good alternatives for people to sell things outside of the trade unless they were very valuable things that they could put at auction. And the auction alternatives were very small at that point. Yeah. Christie's didn't open in the United States until 1976. Park Brené Galleries, transformed into Sotheby's, was not doing very well. They were kind of limping along. There were hardly any regional auction houses. And knowing where to go look for books was a huge advantage. And you and I did many book trips together, going to see people who lots of people wouldn't have known about or sought out. We found lots of treasures in those places. Now the playing field has been leveled to an extraordinary degree, and I think the greatest detriment has been not to the high end of the trade, not to the people dealing in rare books, but to the used book part of the trade. That used to be the feeder system for the rare part of the trade. We used to go to the used bookstores and buy the rarer things that those people knew enough to recognize as good, but really didn't have the ability to market. Now we have so many online ways to sell books, whether it's eBay or whether it's ABAA or Amazon or whether it's the proliferation of auction houses that are in competition with the trade. That's the single huge change that's taken place, and it's, I think, the greatest threat to the antiquarian book business. And I don't say that in a Luddite kind of way. I'm completely willing to embrace the technology, but it does mean that we have to relearn how we buy stuff, how we sell stuff, how we present ourselves, how we market things. And when I look back 20 years ago, I think we had it made. We just had an amazing opportunities available to the people who knew their stuff.
Leveling the playing field has been a difficult thing to swallow.
Yes, it has been. And it's not simply necessarily the leveling of the playing field, but the notion that people have that they can acquire the knowledge they need to know because they can go online and get it. And garbage in, garbage out. Right. Quite often, having knowledge available doesn't do much if you don't know how to process it. And there's so much false processing of knowledge. People looking online, seeing a book listed for $500, assuming that their ratty-tatty copy with a map torn out must be worth $500 because it says that online, etc. That makes it harder for the dealers to acquire material. And to people who don't understand what the trade adds in value, it may make the trade seem overvalued and not appreciate the screening process that's being supplied and expertise that's being applied to putting first-rate stuff in front of collectors as opposed to what you can buy on eBay and take your chances.
Well, one of the things that we've both noticed is so many of the open shops that used to dot the landscape don't exist anymore. And I think that that's probably going to be a thing for the future as well, don't you?
I do. I mean, the whole trend of the trade in the whole time you and I have been in the business has been away from the general carriage trade, open store in a big city, toward being specialized, toward often being by appointment only, often located in the suburbs, and that's simply because the trade hasn't been able to afford the rents.
Yeah.
I mean, right now in New York, which is one of the capitals of rare book dealing as well as rare book collecting, there are only a couple of stores that have, there's only one rare book store, the Bauman's, who have a street front presence. And then there are a few others like Jim Cummins or Ursus who are on an upper floor of a building. But the trade no longer has the presence that it had. And the same is true maybe most markedly in San Francisco, where we used to go up and down Post Street, and you could spend a day seeing the dealers up and down Post Street. And there's now, I think, there's actually no book dealer left on Post Street. There are a few others like Brick Row, but that really has changed the landscape dramatically as well.
Yeah, it used to be a way of acquiring material, and now that method no longer exists.
Exactly.
And so we have to find new methods. How are you with technology? You and I are booksellers who have to use technology. Have you made the transition somewhat easily, or has it been difficult for you to go from way it used to be to way it is?
I'm completely accepting of what technology has brought us. It's brought us a lot of good things too. It's brought us extraordinary ability to research material we have, where before we might have looked at the top of a title page and seen a signature and thought that's interesting and checked in a few sources like the DAB or the Appletons. Now we can dig much deeper and often find out very, very interesting things. Ancestry.com is an online resource that I just find absolutely stupendous.
Yeah,
and the more I've used it, the happier I've been. So it's a double-edged sword. I've put this in a talk I gave at the Grolier Club. The way I looked at it was that when I entered the trade, we were in two businesses. We were, on one hand, in the information business, that we were selling valuable material where you couldn't acquire that information anywhere else. And we were in the antiques business, that we were selling beautiful, rare things to collectors who wanted beautiful, rare things. We're seeing the informational value of the material we're selling melting away like the polar ice caps. Yeah. It's just not going to be there. It's going to be, these books are going to be digitized. It used to be, for example, 30 years ago, that it was very easy to sell government documents. Well, all those things are now digitized. They were searchable. From a research point of view, they've lost their informational value, and many of them have lost any value. The ones that retain value are those that have maps, or they have plates, or they have some aesthetic reason why they're of interest. So I think that it forces us to think more and more about the artifactual value of things and about the value of things, not to try to pretend we're not part of the antiques business. We're as much part of the antiques business as people selling furniture or fine arts. And the parts of the business that were purely informational, you and I both, you far more than me, dealt a lot in periodicals, and we can see that that's now completely gone from the book business. That aspect of the book business just doesn't exist anymore. That's entirely a digital thing. So understanding what our market is first and foremost the thing we've got to do.
As we go into the future, Bill, talk about a little bit about what you see our business becoming in the next 5 or 10 or 15 years. Do you see it flourishing, or do you see it having difficulties?
Well, I'm worried by the fact that there are fewer young people coming into the business than there were. It's easy to walk around a book fair, especially if those of us have been walking around book fairs for decades, and seeing the graying of the trade. We have some great young people coming into the business, and I've been very fortunate to have some of them work for me and have them working for me right now. But it is a much more difficult business to get into, I think, than it was. Back when you got in the trade and when I got in the trade, the majority of purchasing in this country was being done by institutions, and institutions were very democratic in the way they did business. If you had the stuff they wanted, they bought it from you. Right. They didn't care if you were famous or had a great shop presence or so forth. The more we're in the antiques business, the more it becomes a matter of personal contacts, of presentation, of reputation. And the value of books has gone up tremendously simply because of the scarcity of books. Most books are off the market in institutions, and there's less to deal in. 35 years ago, when I was first entering the trade, it still seemed as if there was almost unlimited quantities of books. And now it doesn't seem that way. We live in a market of scarcity. So those are real challenges to anybody entering the trade. A young person who doesn't have contacts or capital can really only get into business by working for a big established firm. And I think we're seeing that a lot of people entering the firm are second careerists, people who were lawyers or they were collectors, they had an enthusiasm for the material, and but they didn't really like, even though they might be making a lot of money in what their career was, they didn't really enjoy it. And they would rather go into the book business even if they made less money because they found it a nice lifestyle and they enjoyed themselves. And that's great, and I certainly welcome those people to the trade, but the people who, to me, have been the heart and soul of the business since I've known it were people who were lifers in the trade. And that the thread of continuity of the trade really rested with them. So that worries me a lot, and the shortage of material available to deal in worries me. We'll keep inventing new things to deal in. There are things that nobody cared about a couple decades ago. I'd say movie scripts, for example, is a very good example, that now become a very, very lively field of dealing. But at the same time, fields where there's not enough critical mass to buy and sell wither and die. Nobody could make a living dealing in Shakespeare these days. You just can't get the great stuff. No. It's not there. And so I'm concerned about that. I'm concerned about the gradual withdrawal of the institutions from the market because they have been one of the backbones of supporting the trade. And quite often the taste of collectors, very reasonably, is going to be for what we think of as the big obvious books. If you don't have any books, you want to start by buying the most important things. But I don't think that it lends itself to a broad basis for the trade. So I have to say that I think the trade still has plenty of life in it, and the antiquarian book world still has plenty of life in it. I'm concerned about the future.
I noticed that over the past several years, you have morphed more towards visual things in your business. Art. You put out an art list every now and then with paintings and things of that nature. Has that been a success for you, or?
It has been. I mean, it's not as much of a change as it might seem. I always had a concept as a person dealing in Americana that I was selling evidence in one form or another, and that evidence might come in the form of photographs, it might come in the form of a manuscript, a letter, a watercolor, an oil painting, it might come in the form of a logbook or a journal, it might come in the form of a broadside, it might come in the form of a pamphlet or a multi-volume set. They're all evidence. And so I've various times tried to do things, and I even did a catalog once called Evidence. And so I see these things all as part of a unified whole. And I've always wanted to try to push the boundaries of what I knew and move myself into more and more areas. I'd also say that I think something that has been very important in my career has been owning books with other dealers. It's been because everybody has their own set of customers who can deal with them. It takes a lot of capital to have a good inventory. And it really is a matter of being able to maximize the use of money and spread the risk. And it's allowed me to handle a lot more books and to learn from my fellow dealers in a lot of ways about areas of the trade I didn't know about and fields I didn't know about. So I've kept pushing the margins of what I do, and more visual stuff has been one of those. I think we're going to see as we move toward it being harder to sell books as information, that manuscripts are going to become more and more interest to the trade, because that's going to be material that it hasn't been digitized, is not available online. So I think we'll see a gradual movement toward the uniqueness of artwork, or the uniqueness of drawings, the uniqueness of manuscript texts, as opposed to printed books.
put a crystal ball in front of yourself and look into it and say to yourself, what is this book world going to be like? I understand your concern with regard to the age situation, but do you see any young booksellers who have real great potential to carry this trade on after guys like you and I are no longer around?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. You know, I'm sure of it. Yeah, I think there are. But I think that the road they're going to have to travel is going to be a tougher road because they're going to have to. But one of the things about it, I mean, you know, I'm completely embracing of technology, but essentially incompetent in it. And the younger dealers are completely comfortable with it, and that gives them an advantage. It gives them advantage in finding stuff, in pursuing stuff, and every aspect of the way the trade's going. So I think the other thing that we're going to see happening is, as part of the institutional withdrawal, is going to be that material is going to come back on the market out of institutions that we would have thought 20 years ago never would have happened.
Yeah, never would have happened.
Because if I was running a small liberal arts college in the Midwest and I had 300,000 volumes and I had special collections that in the 1960s would have been the crown jewel of my library, I now had to make a choice between funding that special collections and being able to get digital resources and millions of books for my students. I wouldn't hesitate to get rid of the special collections if I was in that position. So I think we're going to see a lot of anomalous little special collections, not the great big institutions, not the holders of record, but small institutional libraries are going to give up a lot of special collection material, and that's going to add new life and infuse material back into the business.
And who will be buying this material that's coming out of libraries? Other libraries, collectors?
Well, I think there's always going to be an element of library buying, but I think that the collector aspect of antiquarian book dealing is going to grow and grow. And in a way, we're returning to where the market was in the early part of the 20th century,
right,
where the primary buyers were collectors.
That's right.
The difference is maybe that having a library, having a J. Gadsby library to signify your wealth and your knowledge and your learning doesn't mean the same thing now as it did in the 1920s, when lots of people who had no intention of reading any books collected them. It just doesn't necessarily strike the same chord in a visual culture. So that's really a question. How much will people embrace it? I think people will, particularly in the kind of book you and I deal in, which is primarily historical material. I see collectors emerging in the market, and they're often really going back to what their first love was. They were a history major in college, but they went into finance, they went into Wall Street, they went into law, they became a doctor, they did whatever they did. They get to a certain point in their career where they're well established, they've been successful, their kids are grown up and out of college. And people say, oh, there are no young collectors. There never were a lot of young collectors.
No, there never were.
The typical point, I think, when people have started collecting, it's usually been in their late 40s, their mid to late 40s or 50. When they've got the money, the kids are off to college, they've got some leisure, and they turn back often to the interests, to what they really loved in college, and collect in those areas.
Well, Bill, we've come to the end of our interview. Thanks so much for your thoughts. It was great. I enjoyed it, and thanks for participating.
Always nice to talk to you, Mike.
Like you never do.